All right, let's just jump right in. We're going to look at this really cool experiment that basically shows how we can create value out of, well, out of thin air. It's this wild story about thrift store junk, some seriously famous authors, and a little bit of eBay magic. So, let me ask you a question. What actually gives something its value? I mean, is it what it's made of? How rare it is? Or is it something else entirely? Something you can't really touch?
Okay, check this out. This little Russian figurine was bought for just $3. Then, it sold for almost $200. How is that even possible? What could cause that kind of insane jump in value?
Well, to understand that, we've got to dive into this really interesting field called narrative economics. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's this powerful idea that stories, yeah, just stories, can have a very real and, believe it or not, a measurable impact on our economy.
You know, for the longest time, economists were all about the numbers, the data, the charts. But a Nobel Prize winner, Robert Shiller, basically said, hey, you're all missing a massive piece of the puzzle. And that piece? It's the stories we tell. He argued that big economic events, like booms and busts, aren't just about spreadsheets. They're driven by powerful stories that catch on and spread like wildfire.
And this leads us to this big idea, narrative causality. It sounds complicated, but it's not. It just means that stories aren't passive things. They're not just for entertainment. They're active. They do things. Think about it. If a story about a housing boom goes viral, guess what? It can actually cause a housing boom because people believe it and act on it. The story itself becomes this incredibly powerful economic force.
Okay, so if stories are really that powerful, here's the big question. Can you actually measure that power? Can you put a number on it? Well, that's exactly what a couple of researchers decided to find out with a pretty brilliant experiment.
So these guys, Joshua Glenn and Rob Walker, they're the ones behind something called the Significant Object Project. And they made this really bold claim. They said, you know that emotional value a story creates? We think we can actually measure it, objectively.
So their whole hypothesis was super simple, but also kind of profound. They believe that a good story, a completely made-up, fictional story, could take a worthless piece of junk and turn it into something genuinely significant. And not just in a, oh, that's a nice story kind of way. No, they meant in a way you could measure with cold, hard cash.
So, how'd they do it? The experiment was just beautiful in its simplicity. First, they went out and bought 100 random, cheap things from thrift stores and garage sales. Then, and this is a key part, they got a bunch of really talented writers on board. I'm talking heavy hitters like Colson Whitehead and William Gibson. Each writer was given one of these objects and told to just make up a story for it. Then, they put the object up for sale on eBay. But here's the kicker. The story was the only description. No measurements, no condition details, just the story. And finally, they sat back and measured the results.
And the results? Well, they were absolutely stunning.
Okay, so let's set the baseline. Their total investment for all 100 of these items was just under $130. So, on average, they were spending what, a little over $1 per item? We're talking pocket change here.
And what did they sell all that stuff for? Over $3,600. Just let that sink in for a second. From $130 to over $3,600. And get this, every single object sold for more than they paid for it. I mean, this chart says it all, doesn't it? That tiny little bar on the left, that's what they paid. And that huge bar on the right, that's what people were willing to pay after reading a story. It's just a massive difference.
And when you run the numbers, it comes out to a whopping 2,700% increase in value. They called this the significance premium. And that right there, that is a hard number that shows you the economic power of a story. So let's look at some of the greatest hits from this thing. Remember that Russian figurine from the beginning? It went from $3 to almost $200. There was a Hawk ashtray that sold for over $100 because it came with a story from the sci-fi legend William Gibson. It's so clear, right? People weren't buying the object. They were buying the story. Okay, the results are just undeniable. But the real question is, why did it work so well? What is it about a story that makes us open our wallets?
This quote here really gets to the core of it. When we're faced with uncertainty, like should I buy this weird-looking thrift store item, a story gives us what's called subjective certainty. It's not objective fact, but it feels true. It gives us an emotional reason to believe in the object's value, and that gives us the confidence to click, place bid.
And here's a really important point. This wasn't a trick. The buyers were told up front that the stories were completely made up, so they weren't being duped. They were knowingly and willingly paying extra for the meaning, for the connection that the story provided. The story itself became the thing they were buying.
And there were a few other layers to this that made it even more powerful. First off, the experiment itself was just a great story, right? So people wanted to own a piece of it, like a souvenir. And of course, getting a story written by a famous author, that adds a whole other level of value and cool factor. It's like all these different stories were stacking on top of each other to boost the price.
Okay, so this was a fascinating art project, a cool experiment. But what does it have to do with the real world of business and branding?
Well, as Adweek put it so perfectly when they wrote about the project, what these guys did, it's called advertising. It's the absolute bedrock of all great marketing. You attach a compelling story to your product.
And this isn't just some artsy theory. The numbers in the real world are absolutely staggering. Look at Burberry. They stopped doing boring old ads and started focusing on telling their brand story. The result? Their stock price shot up over 750%. Or what about Tiffany & Co.? They didn't just sell jewelry, they sold the story of true love, and their stock jumped $10 a share in less than a month. The data doesn't lie. Companies with powerful stories just grow way, way faster.
So if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's this. Stories aren't just fluff. They're not just window dressing. They are a fundamental, measurable economic force. They create meaning, and that meaning drives real-world value.
And that brings me to a final question for you. Just look around the room you're in right now. Think about that old concert ticket or that coffee mug you use every day. They're probably not worth much to anyone else, but what are the stories that you've attached to them? What makes them valuable to you? Because in the end, we're all living in our own museum of significant objects, aren't we?